Today we will go into the third part of the heat school or the heat approach. Central to heat is an elemental approach, and today we'll go into what are the elementals which will be the central players in that elemental description of the mind, pathology and healing. So we'll focus today on the elementals. What are the different types of elementals and how do they come into play in the functioning of the mind in generation of pathology? Therefore, how can it help us to heal better? Because we understand pathogenesis in a more elemental way. If we look at heat model, it is a open structural approach. This requires some discussion. There is structuralism, there is post-structuralism, but there is something which is apart from the two, which I call as open structuralism. Structuralism leads to a kind of determinism, and the question there comes is of free will, chance, grace, accidents, the freedom to endow meaning onto certain words, and that freedom cannot be accounted for by any process of determinism. Jung created a model which had a structural flavor. Freud also created a model with a structural flavor. Neither of them claimed to be absolute structuralists nor complete determinists. Both of them realized there were phenomena they could not account for. However, in the philosophical area after structuralism, we had this movement of post-structuralism. And one of the Lacanian ideas in that context is the idea of the parole and the langue. That the structural school essentially is based on the parole and the langue. That there are variety of phenomena, but the reasons for them are few. For example, if we bring this idea into psychotherapy, if we look into CBT, we have three core problems, and all the problems in DSM which can be dealt with by psychotherapy. If you are a quintessential CBT practitioners, all those problems have to ultimately converge into the fundamental three causes. The causation essentially is only three, and everything else, all the problems that you see, ultimately have to emerge from there. So that is the learn of CBT, the three core beliefs. If you go into Freud, there are a few phenomena like Oedipus, fixations in the anal stage, fixations in the oral stage. If you put together the causation of pathology, you will come to 8 to 12 core causes of any pathology. And that for Freud would be his learn. And the parole is this whole landscape of pathology with such variety. The problem there is that in the parole, there exist entities that have been endowed meaning by subjects, by people, exercising their free will. individual and collective. And that is where they supersede or sidestep the determinism of a law. Does the law not influence their discourse? It may not. But even when it does, it is not deterministic in its power. Difficulty with post-structuralism is taken to its extreme, it's a goodbye to science. Because if every law is dismissed, no law remains. And we are saying the goodbye to science. Then it is a phenomena by phenomena, context by context analysis and engagement. And if possible, management. I am not very fond of this approach of post-structuralism. My approach is the limitations of the structural approach should be complemented by something else rather than dismiss the entire structural approach. And this leads to an approach of open structuralism, which is a combination of determinism and freedom. It is neither of the extremes, it is both. Question can be, what is the power of each? I would put it at 75-25. That can differ from person to person, how he views the world. To me, it is 75% structural and determined, and 25% based on freedom, free will, chance, probability, grace, and so on. So the heat model essentially is a model based upon open structuralism. Take the example of colors. You have three primary colors, the lang, and millions of colors which are created out of their combinations, the parole. We can create colors, we can endow meaning to colors. That does not mean the lang of the colors doesn't exist. A temporary lang culturally can be created and it goes away. But there are enduring lang, fundamental lang, which stay culture proof, individual proof. Some of them even history proof. So the heat model is an open structural model where there are two elements. One, it is a structural model, but in that structure, there are open spaces to account for phenomena which cannot be determined in a structural way in terms of causality. And there are these open spaces which also provide openings in another way. We'll come to it again, but just to foresay it. The openness in the heat model has two elements. One, openness to incorporate and allow the non-structural, non-deterministic, freedom-based elementals and phenomena to be engaged with. And second, in that structure of the mind, when you move from one layer to the other layer, there are open spaces between them where you can move across the layer without interacting with the layer. Say, for example, if you look at Jung's model of the mind, there is self, and then the collective unconscious, the personal unconscious, and the conscious. So if something has to move from the collective unconscious to the conscious, it has to move through the personal unconscious, which would mean it interacts with the contents of the personal unconscious. There cannot be a direct transport from the collective unconscious to the conscious bypassing the personal unconscious. But if you provide an open space there in the personal unconscious, certain contents of the collective unconscious can go to the conscious without interacting with the personal unconscious elements. And that is the kind of intra-model open spaces which are incorporated in the heat model. So any structural model has these elements, that there are elementals which interact with each other according to forces which are governed by laws, and this interaction of elementals according to forces produces a phenomenon. That is the core of any structural approach. This phenomena in our context, in the psychological context, psychotherapy context, can be a pathological phenomena, a normal phenomena, or a supernormal phenomena based on the qualitative aspect of the phenomena. The normal phenomena is usually the study of those who are into human resource management. The pathological phenomena usually a subject for us, those who are into therapy, and supernormal generally for those who are into positive psychology, paranormal, or human potential movement aspect of the psyche. Let us focus on the pathological aspect, that if the phenomena is pathological in nature, then if we understand that phenomena in elemental terms, in terms of the elementals and the forces involved, and if the phenomena pertains to pathogenesis, then we understand pathogenesis in elemental terms. Therefore, healing also in elemental terms. And I'll elaborate on this as we go along. And once we understand pathogenesis and healing in elemental terms, there is a possibility of understanding the state into which the person exists at any given moment. For example, somebody is in a high anxiety state, or rather, let me say somebody has high anxiety at any given moment. How do we describe the state that he is in? He not only has high anxiety, there are certain thoughts going on, certain bodily sensations going on. There is a full state. If you take a slice of the moment, there is a full state of the person. And the elemental understanding of the state, the better we can do it, better we understand the state in which pathology is active. So the activation and deactivation of certain thing is very important. It's a very important phenomena that mostly is not studied. The phenomena of activation and deactivation. Activation and deactivation of certain things creates a state. And in that state, the pathology may be active, may not be active. The state is a larger entity than just an active pathology, which is one constituent of that state. And if we can understand the state in elemental terms, we can then go to understand the quality of life, because it's a quality of state, and the states we pass through, the quality of any given state and the states we pass through, that determines the quality of life. So the elemental approach allows us not only to understand and heal pathology in elemental terms, but also to describe a state and from there quality of life. Let us now go to what are the type of elementals which are involved in heat. In the heat model, because it is an elemental model, we will describe the functioning of the mind, pathogenesis and healing in elemental terms. And for doing that, we have to first bring into our discussion what are the various types of elementals involved in this model. So if you look here, we can see three major categories of elementals. The structural elementals, which constitute structurally the mind. The process or the functional elementals. The functional elementals or process elementals, which are involved in the processes involved in the mind, in that structure. And the third is freedom elementals, which complement the structural aspect of the model. The structural elements pertain to they are like the building blocks of the mind. So if you look at a building and we have the beams, the columns, the bricks, they constitute the structural component of a building. Similarly, if you look at the mind, we have structural components in every theory. If you look at Freud's theory, it is the ego and superego. These three components, they build up the structure of the mind. If you look at the Jungian theory, the self, the archetypes, the personal unconscious, the conscious and the ego, they constitute the structural elements of Jung's model of the mind. If we look at West Indian psychology, the chakras, the nadis, they constitute the structural components of the psyche. So the structural elements, they constitute how the mind is created in terms of the structure. So when we go to the heat model of the mind, we will see what are the structural elements. But the structural elements to understand from contemporary existing knowledge, just as Freud uses ego, superego as structural elements, Jung uses self, archetypes, collective unconscious, personal unconscious, ego as his structural elements, and just as Eastern psychology uses chakras and nadis and the 5 sheets of the bodies as their structural elements. So heat model also uses some elementals which are structural elementals which constitute the mind in a structural sense. Then within that structure, associated with that structure, psychological processes happen. And these psychological processes involve process elementals. And they are of different types. First is the motivational elementals. So desire comes first. And we have there two. The desire of the soul to exist and experience satisfaction and frustrations of hundreds of small desires, and from there to extract the essence of experience. So there is this core desire which manifests itself in hundreds and millions of small desires. So motivational elemental refers to our desires, the core desire and small desires. The small desires pertain to our desire for sense pleasure, our desires for sexuality, our desires for knowledge, desire for love, desire for mystical knowledge, desire for power. All the desires are there. So motivational elementals refers to our desires, the generic motivations that we have. That is where the psychological process starts, with desire. Once desire is activated, then the activated desire sets in motion operation of certain generic elementals like affinity, life energy, and so on. We'll understand as we go along what are these generic operational elementals. Then there are some specific kind of process elementals which I call as faculty elementals, like thinking, imagination, intuition, reflection. All these are not reflection, intuition and reflexes. These are faculty elementals. These are faculties that are used for a psychological process. So psychological process needs first a motivation. Why should the process occur at all? And that is desires of various types. And then we have, once the desires are activated, certain generic operational elementals are called out, and then the faculty elementals are used. For example, thinking is a faculty elemental. It might be used how to satisfy this desire. And then there are characteristic elementals. They are like catalysts, like hope, positivity, taste. They are more like catalysts, or they are like bystanders who occasionally involve in processes like a catalyst, giving certain flavor and direction. Occasionally they don't. So these are characteristic elementals. You can use some other name also, but these are a different category of elementals. This, once it starts with desire, then the psychological process starts, involves the faculty elementals, uses their cognitive capabilities, their experience, characteristic elements at times come into play, and all of this 1 to 4 either leads to action or non-action. And in either case, there is a result which is a post-action result in psychological sense. In the real world, there may be action or non-action, and the result is pleasure, pain, frustration, and so on. These elementals which are activated after a psychological act is over are what I call as a resultant elementals. And it is to experience the essence of resultant elementals that the soul generates desire in the first place. And from this resultant elemental, pleasure or pain, we learn something, templates are built. And that learning which is accumulating with every experience, I call as accumulating elemental. So learning, template, at times fear, at times satisfaction, at times increased addiction, at times freedom from it, all these are accumulating elementals, which are elementals that get activated or augmented or strengthened or weakened after the resultant elementals are fully felt. So these are like learning or templates, entanglement of addiction or freedom. So these are different kinds of elementals, and in each category we will have 5 to 12 different elementals. In some categories we almost have 18 sub variables. And then we have freedom elementals. Elementals like free will of ourselves, free will of somebody else, grace of somebody, luck, accidents. These are freedom elementals which cannot be accounted for in the structural elemental which is here. All of this is the structural part, 1 and 2. But everything cannot be explained by 1 and 2. Everything cannot be healed or accounted for in terms of pathogenesis by 1 and 2. And there we look forward to freedom elementals. So these are the different types of elementals in the heat model. As we go along, we will have one presentation each, a short presentation on each category of elementals. One on structural, one on motivational, one on generic operational, faculty, characteristic, and so on. And once we are done with this description of elementals, understanding of elementals, we will then take a look at the structure. And after looking at elementals and the structure, we get into operation, how this model operates. Now, can we have more category of elementals? Of course we can. I think as we go along, the categories of elementals will shift. Some will get modified, some will get added, some will get deleted. All of that will happen as a natural part of model development. So comprehensive list is actually a work in progress. It will take a long time before we are able to consolidate into finality a list. There can be derivative elementals. Of course, there can be two elementals which we have described coming together to create a third one. Of course, there can be a list of forces. Of course, that has to be developed. This model as yet does not give an account fully of the forces involved. Also does not give into account fully the biological aspect involved, the parapsychological or the transpersonal in terms of process details that remains to be added to the model. On genesis and purpose, of course, these are philosophical areas. So each person, based on what he believes in, can have a different opinion. Different schools will have different opinions on this. This is an area of philosophy where differences can always happen and should happen. It facilitates more discussion, more generation of knowledge. So this is how the HEAT model is a model in process, in development, and it is a very promising model that integrates different schools of psychoanalysis with the Eastern schools and adds to it something more to create a more integrated, a more complete model. But definitely this is still an incomplete model. It is a work in progress, long way to go, and it will take years before it is fully developed, or it gives ideas for a better model which can be fully developed replacing this model. Either is possible, we will see as it turns around. So this is the overview of elementals. In further presentations, we will go into details of each of the category of elementals, what are the sub elementals in that category and how they operate, what is their significance in the working of the mind, pathogenesis and healing. We'll see it as we go ahead. Thank you.